Hello and welcome to That Encyclopedia podcast with your hosts, me, Will, and Jacob.
Hello.
Today we'll be discussing one of science's most gargantuan figures. We're discussing Galileo Galilei. Now, Galileo Galilei, I'd say what it interests me about him is he's obviously known as one of the great champions of the heliocentric model of the solar system. So Galileo wrote about and defended the concept that the Earth revolved around the sun at a time when it was not very okay to say so, according to the Catholic Church. But what I think is of note about Galileo is that he's possibly more famous than the man who developed the heliocentric model, which was, of course, Nicholas Copernicus. But we're talking mostly about Galileo today, and Galileo did a pretty solid job at defending this. But aside from this, he had a number of other accomplishments, various works of physics on speed and velocity, observational astronomy, so he developed telescopes and he observed moons of Jupiter, he observed phases of Venus, he observed Saturn's rings, lunar craters and sunspots, and he had actually quite an interesting and somewhat nuanced relationship with the Catholic Church. He wasn't always the enemy of the Catholic Church, for he was once friends with a man who went on to become the Pope. All in all, quite a dramatic life, at least in terms of what he's remembered for. What do you think of Galileo?
Well, I think that calling Galileo a titan in the history of science would be a bit of an understatement. He is considered by many to be the father of modern science, certainly the father of astronomy, and I think by certain figures in the history of science, like Albert Einstein and Stephen Hawking, is cited as the most influential figure on scientific development, at least insofar as the Western world is concerned. I actually want to just start on something you mentioned at the end of the introduction there, Will, and it's a bit tangential to Galileo specifically, but it's going to escape my head otherwise. You said that Galileo knew or was friends with someone who went on to become the Pope, right?
Yes.
This is often the case when reading the biographies of historic figures on Wikipedia. It seems like such a small world. I think that presence of hyperlinks everywhere helps, and the benefit of hindsight sees connections that maybe weren't as important at the time. But it strikes me as bizarre or astounding coincidence that the man responsible for all of these discoveries and who would come into conflict, even if kind of unintentionally, with the Catholic Church, just so happened to be friends with someone who would go on to become the Pope. I don't know, it just seems strange. Is it maybe a byproduct of having such a small population hundreds of years ago relative to today?
I mean,
is it because it's more stratified and class-based back then? I don't know.
Reminiscent of the old Roman tales, isn't it?
Yeah, precisely. But yes, I'm excited to talk about Galileo today. I imagine this going sort of in a 50-50 split. Obviously, the man is worthy of discussion by himself, but I think he also serves as an excellent springboard from which to jump into a more philosophical, or dare I say political, discussion of the relationship between science and religion and institutional authorities all intermingling with each other, which is something that I touched a little bit with the Carl Sagan episode, but there it was more personal to Sagan himself, whereas here it has implications for how we interpret and understand the world we live in and the reality we face. But first things first, the life of Galileo, whose full name, and I preface this by saying I don't speak Italian, was apparently Galileo di Vincenzo Buonaiuti de Galilei, which is beautiful. And it's often the case with capital R romantic names that they're quite extended, and being able to roll them off the tongue is a privilege. What do you think that his scientific discoveries were sort of... No, actually, I'll rephrase that. Of his scientific discoveries, which one would you say it has been the most important or the most influential?
Good question. That's a challenging one. I'm just having a think. To be honest, it's impossible for me to say from what I read. Possibly the invention of he did a lot of inventing, did Galileo. So what's difficult for me, having just read this article once, is establishing which things he substantially invented with novelty and which things he improved upon, and whether or not his improvements were among his sort of greatest and most influential work. So just to name a few things, he invented a device called the thermoscope, which detects some temperature changes. So it's in a way the ancestor of the modern thermometer. Now, I don't really know about the development of the modern thermometer, but it's possible that this was a significant step in that. Also, he worked on the improvements to the sector or military compass, which is an instrument for solving a number of problems relating to geometry, trigonometry, and proportion. So maybe that's important. I don't know. What I found interesting, though, I'll just talk about an interesting discovery of his, was his discovery of the 4 largest moons of Jupiter. So, as we said already, he built some telescopes, and that was, in a way, one of his side hustles, was building telescopes with 9 times magnification and selling them as props for wealthy people and tools to anyone that could sort of afford or need something like that. But he built some pretty good ones for himself. I think he achieved a 30 times magnification. He liked to look at the sky and to look at the stars. He noticed that there were some previously believed stars near to Jupiter in the night sky, but upon observation they moved in quite a peculiar way, and it was Galileo who noted in the year 1610, so we get some timeline on this. So Galileo was born in the 16th century and died in the 17th. He noticed that the satellites, as we now call them, the supposed stars, were moving in a way that would potentially indicate that they were passing behind Jupiter. He looked at them and he looked at them and he decided these things must be orbiting Jupiter. These are the 4 largest moons of Jupiter. But why am I finding this interesting, aside from the astronomy? Well, allegedly, is it another country? I think so. In Germany, on the 8th of January, 1610, bear in mind Galileo discovered these moons on January 7th, 1610, and then later on January 10th decided that they were orbiting Jupiter. Just one day after Galileo is documented to have observed these stars that became known as moons, a man named Simon Marius discovered, or claims to have discovered, the same 4 moons. And I believe this caused a little bit of a row. It's not mentioned so much on Galileo's page, but I went into Simon Maris's page, and it's not actually the first time that this sort of issue comes up, where there's another scientist working on a similar project, and there's been a bit of a spat over who found what first. But there was, even recently, I think it was, there was a jury in the Netherlands in 1903 examining whether or not Marius had independently discovered these moons. And this was published in 1907, so this was, bear in mind, a long time after his death. So
wow, that is, what a bummer to the person who discovered them second at the end of it. Like, that must be so heartbreaking. I mean, you might not ever know at the time, I suppose, but that sort of thing still happens today in the modern scientific community more often than people would think. Work that is published through peer-reviewed journals needs to be original and build on what came before. And so if two people or two groups are independently researching the same thing just by complete coincidence, and one publishes first, then unless the second one is demonstrably different in some way, unless it makes some additional or otherwise distinct contribution, then often it can't be published because it's no longer original work, even though there was no plagiarism or malice intended. And years of work can and has gone down the tube due to these awful coincidences, and it's happened all throughout history. And this is a good example. There's actually another one involving Galileo in the same vein, although I haven't looked into it as much. But in the Moon subsection under Galileo's scientific discoveries, the article claims that Galileo is sometimes credited with the discovery of the lunar libration in latitude in 1632. In other words, the discovery of the moon being tidally locked, although they weren't familiar with tidal locking at the time, which means that only one side of the moon faces the Earth. It doesn't spin on its axis relative to us, so we have the bright side of the moon and the dark side of the moon. Galileo is sometimes credited with this discovery, but there was an English... there was a physician called William Gilbert and another scientist called Thomas Harriot who may have done it first. The article doesn't make a definitive judgment either way, but there you go. Just even back then, almost 400 years ago now, these sorts of things were happening and continue to happen to this day. It's an unusual and quite distressing connection to the past.
Well, you mentioned tides. I wonder if I could link in from the article what I would consider, and this is perhaps unfair, but I think we're giving a lot of cheerleading to Galileo, so we're allowed to throw in some critique there. Galileo's worst discovery or invention is Galileo's theory of tides, I would say. See,
yes, I agree.
Galileo was fairly convinced that his theory of tides was the ultimate proof of Earth's motion. So it ties in quite closely with what he is famous for. So if you've heard of Galileo, you may be aware of some of the what is termed the Galileo affair, where he was sort of in trouble. He did an oopsie because his oopsie was defending the heliocentric model, when at the time the church was quite adamant that no, the sun and everything else revolves around Earth. He wrote a famous book, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, where he was supposedly weighing up and comparing both models, but it's widely regarded the case that he was attempting to argue against the alternative model with the heliocentric model, and he depicted the person he was arguing against as a bit of a fool. But interestingly, he was quite interested in this theory of tides as proof of Earth's motion, where he believed that the movement of Earth caused the seas to slosh back and forth, and that was what caused the tides. So
I love that theory. It's like Albert Einstein described this as a fascinating argument, and I agree. Like, it's such an intuitive idea to, you know, pour water into a bowl or something similar and, you know, spin it. Okay, look, hey, it's sloshing back and forth one side and then the other as its momentum from spinning, causing inertia on the water. And let's just scale it up. If we accept that our planet's basically spherical and it's basically full of water, then the same thing should happen. It's really intuitive and makes a lot of sense.
Well, especially
it's just completely wrong.
So the sort of the sloshing could make sense given, like, obviously if you were to sling it around in like a perfect circle, the water might pool in a sort of central point. But because Earth's surface speeds up and slows down due to rotation on axis and revolution around the sun, he, I suppose, reasonably believed that this was a sloshing motion that was going on. I just think it's really interesting that he considers this proof of Earth's motion, when of course he is right about the heliocentric model, but he is wrong about this being proof of it. And if he was to discover the that fact you mentioned about the moon and its locking with the tide, I just find that really interesting. You could even say he was close to connecting the dots, and in fact in history he kind of was. It wasn't much long after, to be fair, that Isaac Newton came around and was like, yo, gravity. So
yeah, he was so close in a lot of ways, and scientists often are. Like, the history of science is built on the shoulders of everyone who came before. And if someone has one dodgy theory but makes all of these other contributions, that's still a net gain for science overall. However, it has been a net loss for the Catholic Church. Maybe we should turn to the reason Galileo is famous above all the others, this controversy over heliocentrism, aka the Galileo affair, which is its own separate article. But briefly, Galileo was a big proponent of the heliocentric model developed by Copernicus, and the Catholic Church was not, believing it to be heretical, contrary to biblical scripture. Galileo published a tome that the article says something like kind of was accidentally mocking to the Catholic side. Galileo, of course, was Catholic himself, and it says that here we go. Pope Urban VIII had personally asked Galileo to give arguments for and against heliocentrism in this book that he was working on, and to be careful not to explicitly advocate heliocentrism. So this is important as a precursor. The Pope was aware that his friend, Galileo, was producing such a tome, had endorsed its production on the condition that it was not an overt advocate for the heliocentric model, but more of a dialogue between two sides. Unknowingly, potentially, it could have been deliberate, but I think the consensus is this is just an awkward, unforeseen complication. The character in the book that defends the Aristotelian geocentric view is called Simplicio, which is from the Latin Simplicius, which is named after a famous Aristotelian philosopher. So it's acknowledging the history of philosophy in that way. But the name, as you may have already established, Simplicio has the connotation of simpleton, moron, idiot, fool. And so when the book, which was called Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, was published, there was horrific backlash. And this blindsided Galileo, forced the Pope to take action. An inquisition was held from the Catholic Church. Galileo was found vehemently suspect of heresy, though not quite convicted of heresy directly, which would have been a much more severe charge, and the book was kind of prescribed, and Galileo was confined to house arrest for the rest of his life. He continued his studies, but ultimately died at the age of 77 in his villa under house arrest in what was then the Grand Duchy of Tuscany.
So you can imagine that it was quite embarrassing for the Pope and the Church, after having essentially endorsed this book before it was published, for the book to then come out and for members of the religious community to read it and be like, what is this? This is ridiculing our religious beliefs. Is not going to make the Pope very happy, given that he had, in good faith, presumed Galileo was going to weigh up the arguments in sort of a more respectful way.
Yeah, and by all accounts, Galileo, it was a complete accident. It was a reference to this real Aristotelian philosopher, and didn't realise the implication. It's an unusual circumstance, and it feels quite personal, in a sense. But the Galileo controversy has been brought up again and again throughout history. It has a legacy of its own, and more recent popes have weighed in to comment on it. The prescription of heliocentrism from the Church was only fully rescinded in the 19th century, although it had been weakening for quite some time before then. So it took another 200 years almost for the Church to completely reverse its position. Do you think there's any relevance or lessons from this controversy that are applicable to the modern world, not necessarily with respect to the Catholic Church, but just any sort of institutional politicking versus science, anything like that? Or do you think it's sort of a bit blown out of proportion, and it's more of a slap on the wrist in response to a personally embarrassing situation?
No, I think it's interesting how it relates to the modern world, because I think it highlights something that might be becoming more challenging, maybe, in the modern world. So I would definitely say it was quite harmful, because he was not supposed to publish once he was under house arrest, and given that he was a scientist at the forefront of invention and discovery, that's quite a big blow. That's quite a big blow to him, and a big blow to the scientific community, I think. Now, how this relates to the modern world, I think, is that I think we will probably agree that we have some challenges in the modern day, and I'm sure we always have done, given that, I mean, the Catholic Church used to be the power that decided what model of the universe to adopt, but we have a problem with scientific misinformation and what to actually do about it. See, and I think this is particularly exacerbated by modern media. Now, ideally, we like to think, and certainly in terms of views of the establishment academics, over history, people present their ideas and they present their evidence, and eventually we move towards a more and more accurate consensus, and that's the hope with science. And that might still be happening today. I mean, I don't doubt that within mainstream science we're making significant progress, but in terms of the effect on the public, and especially the effect on the public when it comes to issues of politics or issues of public health, scientific and medical misinformation can be incredibly harmful. And I don't think it's unreasonable that there are cases in which some forms of censorship occur, but as we can see looking at the story of Galileo, I would say the censorship of Galileo was probably not a just thing, because at the end of the day he didn't do anything hugely harmful, and he was a proponent of ideas that we now think are correct. Well, and we think he was right, and he was right to say what he said and sort of do what he did. So how do we tackle people today who are spreading ideas that we think go against the consensus? And that is a difficult question, because simply combating them with other information, it can work, but it doesn't stop misinformation from spreading, and it doesn't stop misinformation from being harmful. Is there anything we can do more? These are challenging questions.
I think it's often lost in general discussion that the scale at which science revises itself as new information and data become available is of critical importance. By that I mean the broad strokes of how the world works, how the laws of physics apply themselves, how evolution occurs, so on and so forth. The basics of chemistry have not only been known for hundreds, in some cases thousands of years, but they're not really in debate, they're not up for discussion. Science revises itself in a fractal way, I would say. There are exceptions, and the Galileo controversy would be one of them, where the entire worldview, literally, of society was purportedly wrong and shattered, and this turned out to be correct ultimately. But it's really the exception rather than the rule, and I think it's very easy to use new discoveries in science in bad faith as evidence that the entire system or foundation is faulty. Because while that has occasionally been true throughout history, I can think of maybe like 5 examples across 3,000 years of scientific development. For the overwhelming majority of cases, it's minor revisions, small number changes. The implications are not as world-shattering as Galileo's particular case. So I think I'd agree, it's an extremely important case study with a lot of relevance to the modern world, and with respect to scientific misinformation, I think that's where it falls, as sort of an exception to prove the existence of the rule. That would be my opinion. And I think with that, we are probably more or less out of time. So that's Galileo, a brilliant astronomer, an engineer in a time before there were engineers, and possibly the father of modern science. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. We'll see you next time.